They called her just a maid, until the millionaire's son chose her as his mother. What she sacrificed for this family turned scandal into love, and shame into a wedding no one saw coming. Before I begin the story, I'd like to say a quick prayer for you, my dear family. May your days be filled with peace, your heart with joy, and your steps guided by light. Amen. If you're happy to be here, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Rain tapped lightly against the cracked window pane of the servants' quarters, a rhythm as steady as the beating of Clara's heart. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the springs groaning beneath her slight weight, her hands raw from another day of scrubbing marble floors that shone like glass. The faint smell of soap clung to her palms, no matter how many times she rinsed them. Clara was 26, though the world had aged her faster. Her deep brown eyes carried shadows of sleepless nights. Her shoulders stooped not from weakness, but from years of carrying burdens far heavier than her own. She had worked in the Hamilton mansion for 6 years now. 6 years of rising before dawn, of silence when insulted, of bowing her head when others raised theirs high. Yet she carried herself with a quiet grace that no insult could strip away. The other servants whispered about it sometimes, how Clara, though dressed in a faded uniform and plain shoes, walked as though she belonged among chandeliers and velvet drapes. Outside, the storm gave way to the hum of the city beyond the estate walls. Inside, the mansion's grand halls glittered with chandeliers, mirrors, and marble staircases that spiraled like ribbons of wealth. It was a palace, a monument to one man's success. Richard Hamilton, the millionaire whose name commanded respect in every corner of the city. Clara often thought the house itself was a reflection of its owner. Vast, intimidating, beautiful to outsiders, yet cold to those who lived within its walls. She had never spoken more than a handful of words to Mr. Hamilton directly, just yes, sir, or good evening, sir. Still, his presence filled every corridor like a shadow. Her true encounters were with his son, Daniel. Unlike his father, Daniel often paused to acknowledge her. Sometimes it was only a nod in the hallway. Other times it was a gentle word of thanks when she poured his tea. For Clara, even those brief gestures were enough to remind her that kindness still existed within this house of stone. But tonight was different. Tonight, as she washed the silver in the dimly lit kitchen, she overheard voices drifting from the grand dining room, the sound of crystal glasses clinking, of laughter that felt sharp rather than warm. She paused, her hands submerged in the soapy water, listening. Such a shame, one voice purred. A woman's voice, silken and laced with arrogance. A man of your stature, Mr. Hamilton, should not be wasting his son's attention on trivial people. Trivial people. Clara knew immediately who they meant. Her cheeks flushed, though no one could see her in the shadows. Richard Hamilton's deep, commanding voice answered, tinged with amusement. Don't trouble yourself, Veronica. Daniel will come to his senses. He always does. These distractions never last. The table erupted in laughter. 3 women, all as polished as diamonds, their laughter chiming like silver bells. Clara recognized the names, Veronica, Isabella, and Catherine, 3 of the city's most admired women, all vying for Daniel's hand. They arrived often in gowns worth more than Clara could ever earn in a year, their perfume trailing behind them like invisible crowns. She forced herself to return to the silverware, her hands trembling slightly as she scrubbed, yet her ears burned with each word that floated in from the dining hall. Then came Daniel's voice, calm, steady, but firm. You speak of people as if they're furniture, Veronica. Not everyone measures worth in gowns and pearls. There was a pause, the silence heavier than thunder. Clara froze, her heart thudding painfully. Veronica's voice turned sharp. And what would you know of worth, Daniel? You've never known hardship. The only thing you've ever lacked is taste and company. Richard's laugh followed, low and dismissive. Enough, Veronica. He's young. He'll learn. The conversation shifted, but Clara could not unhear it. Daniel had defended her. She knew it, even if no one had said her name aloud. The warmth that bloomed in her chest frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Later that night, when the guests had gone and silence returned to the halls, Clara carried fresh linen to the upper floor. She moved quietly, careful not to disturb the wealthy world that slept in silk sheets. As she approached Daniel's door, she found it slightly ajar, a soft glow spilling into the hallway. Inside, Daniel sat at his desk, papers scattered before him. He looked up, surprise flickering in his blue-gray eyes when he saw her. "Clara," he said softly. "Not maid, not girl, her name." She lowered her gaze, clutching the folded linen to her chest. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You didn't." His voice was gentle, almost weary. "Sometimes I think you're the only one in this house who sees things clearly." Her heart stumbled at his words. She wanted to ask what he meant, but dared not. Instead, she offered a quiet nod and placed the linen at the foot of his bed. As she turned to leave, he said something that would stay with her for years. "Don't ever let them convince you you're less than they are, Clara. They don't even know what worth means." For a moment, the silence between them was alive, filled with unspoken truths. Then she slipped out, closing the door gently behind her, her chest tight with emotions she could not name. The next morning dawned bright, the storm a memory. The mansion stirred with preparations for yet another gathering, a charity gala hosted by Richard Hamilton himself. The marble floors gleamed, chandeliers glittered, and fresh flowers filled every vase. The world would come to see wealth paraded like a crown, and Clara would move among them unseen, carrying trays, pouring champagne, watching for the edges. But in the quiet corners of her heart, something had begun to change. She was no longer just a maid. She was the girl Daniel had defended, the girl he had called by name, the girl who, in a house built on pride and gold, still held on to her dignity like a flame that refused to go out. And though she didn't know it yet, that flame would soon burn bright enough to change the course of all their lives. Hers, Daniel's, and even Richard Hamilton's himself. Richard Hamilton's mornings began not with alarm clocks, but with silence. At exactly 6 o'clock, the curtains of his master bedroom parted automatically, revealing the sprawling gardens below. Beyond the wrought iron gates stretched the city he practically owned, its skyline pierced with buildings financed by his hand, its economy oiled by his investments. He was 55, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples and a face weathered by decades of deals, betrayals, and victories. His presence filled every room he entered. He was the kind of man whose handshake could decide a future, whose approval could elevate or destroy careers. People described him as ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. Yet Richard's life, though lined with gold, was lonely. His wife had passed away nearly 15 years ago, leaving him with a son he never quite understood. Daniel was intelligent, yes, but too soft, too idealistic. Richard had built an empire from sweat and cunning. Daniel preferred books, art, and conversations with people far below their social station. This morning, as Richard dressed in his tailored suit, he caught his reflection in the mirror. His dark eyes stared back at him, sharp but tired. He adjusted his cufflinks, each engraved with the Hamilton crest, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had come from nothing, a factory worker's son who had clawed his way into the world of wealth. That climb had left scars, invisible but deep. His late wife used to tell him, "Richard, money is a tool, not a crown." But he had dismissed her words. In his mind, money was everything. Without it, people were weak, powerless, invisible. He had vowed never to be invisible again. At breakfast, the dining room glowed with sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The long mahogany table gleamed, set with silverware that Clara herself had polished the night before. Richard sat at the head, Daniel at his right. Across from Daniel sat Catherine, one of the three women Richard hoped his son would choose. She was elegant in a pale lavender dress, her blonde hair styled to perfection. She laughed softly at something Daniel said. Though Richard noticed his son's eyes never quite lit up. "Young men must marry well," Richard declared suddenly, his deep voice echoing in the vast room. He wasn't just speaking to Daniel. He was laying down law, not for themselves, but for the family name, for the legacy. Daniel sipped his coffee without reply. Catherine smiled sweetly. "And some of us young women are quite ready to step into that role, Mr. Hamilton." Richard's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Catherine understood. That's what mattered. When the meal ended, Catherine excused herself, her perfume lingering in the air. Richard turned to his son. "You could do worse," he said simply. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You mean I could do better in your eyes?" "Father, I'm not a transaction. I'm not an extension of your empire." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You are my son. That means you are the empire." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Daniel rose from the table, pushing his chair back with a scrape, and left without another word. Richard sighed, leaning back. His son's defiance was not new. Still, unsettled him more than he liked to admit. He poured himself another cup of black coffee, staring out the window at the manicured gardens below. Somewhere among the hedges and fountains, the maid moved quietly, unseen, arranging flowers for tonight's gala. He did not know her name. He did not care to. To him, servants were part of the machinery that kept his world polished and perfect. But fate has a way of humbling even the proudest. That evening, the mansion bloomed with guests. The grand ballroom glittered with chandeliers, the air filled with music and laughter. Men in tuxedos and women in gowns moved like jewels across the polished floor. Richard stood at the center, the host and master of it all, shaking hands, accepting praise, his every gesture commanding attention. The three women, Veronica, Isabella, and Catherine, floated around him like satellites, each vying for his son's side. Their beauty drew eyes, their wealth drew whispers, but their smiles were masks, each one calculating. Richard noticed none of it. What he did notice was Daniel's absence from their company. His son stood near the edge of the room, speaking quietly with one of the staff. Richard's brows furrowed. He excused himself from a conversation with the senator and moved toward Daniel, only to realize who the staff was. The maid, Clara. She stood with her hands folded, eyes lowered, her uniform plain against the backdrop of sequins and silk. Yet there was something in her stillness that unsettled Richard, a dignity he did not expect. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't grasping for attention. She simply existed, calm, unshaken, like a flame that refused to flicker, even in a storm of wealth. Daniel said something that made her smile just faintly, before she dipped her head and slipped away into the crowd. Richard's jaw tightened. He stepped beside his son. "What are you doing?" he hissed under the music. Daniel turned to him, calm, talking. "With a servant?" Richard's voice was sharp. "Have you no sense of place?" Daniel's eyes met his, steady, unflinching. "Maybe I see something you don't, Father. Maybe worth isn't defined by pearls and champagne." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted to argue, to lecture, to crush that defiance. But something in his son's tone silenced him. For the rest of the night, though he smiled and played the gracious host, Richard could not shake the image of the maid's steady eyes and quiet smile. It irritated him, like a grain of sand in a polished shoe. He told himself it meant nothing. But the truth was, for the first time in years, Richard Hamilton had been unsettled. Daniel Hamilton was not like the other children his age. Most boys of 7 spent their afternoons running in parks, scraping their knees, chasing kites. But Daniel's world was marble floors and towering bookshelves, endless lessons with tutors who never smiled, and formal dinners where laughter was measured and childhood was unwelcome. His father, Richard Hamilton, had decided early that his only son would never know weakness. Daniel would grow into a man of steel, polished, and prepared to inherit the Hamilton empire. But in the process, he had stripped away the very thing that made Daniel different: his need for warmth, for companionship, for love. On this particular morning, Daniel sat at the long oak table in the study, his legs swinging restlessly beneath the heavy chair. A tutor droned on about arithmetic, chalk tapping against the board. Numbers danced across the slate, but Daniel's mind was elsewhere. He glanced toward the window where sunlight streamed in, catching dust motes that floated like tiny golden stars. He sighed, wishing he could chase them instead of memorizing sums. When the lesson finally ended, he bolted from the chair, his small leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. He slipped into the back corridors of the mansion, the places where the chandeliers didn't shine and the air smelled faintly of soap. That was where he found Clara. She was kneeling on the floor, a pail of water beside her, scrubbing the tiles until they gleamed. Her dark hair was tied back, a few strands falling loose against her cheeks. She hummed softly, a tune Daniel didn't recognize but found comforting. "Good morning, Miss Clara," he said, his voice shy but eager. She looked up, surprised, then smiled, the kind of smile Daniel never saw at dinner parties. Warm, real. "Good morning, young master." Daniel wrinkled his nose. "Don't call me that. I'm just Daniel." Clara's smile widened. "All right then. Good morning, Daniel." He grinned, dropping to the floor beside her. "What are you singing?" "It's an old song," she said gently. "Something my mother used to sing to me when I was your age." "Can you sing it louder?" he asked. Her laughter bubbled softly. "Maybe when we're not supposed to be working." Daniel leaned against the wall, watching her hands move in steady circles over the tiles. For reasons he didn't fully understand, he liked being near her. She didn't treat him like a project to mold, like his tutors. She didn't ignore him, like many of the adults at his father's parties. She simply saw him. Just Daniel, not the heir to the Hamilton fortune. "Why do you always work so hard?" he asked suddenly. Clara paused, sitting back on her heels. Her eyes softened. "Because hard work keeps me honest. And it reminds me where I come from." Daniel frowned. "But father says people who work like this are less important." Clara's gaze flickered, pain flashing for just a moment before she masked it with patience. "Your father sees the world one way, but that doesn't mean it's the only way. Sometimes the people who seem the least important are the ones who carry the most weight." Daniel thought about that. At 7 years old, he didn't have the words to argue with his father. But he knew Clara's words felt right in a way his father's pronouncements never did. Later that week, the Hamilton mansion hosted another dinner party. Daniel was forced into a tiny suit, his hair combed so stiffly it hurt. He sat at the long table beside his father, staring at the glittering plates of food he had no appetite for. The 3 women, Veronica, Isabella, and Catherine, sat nearby, their laughter filling the room like tinkling glass. Daniel felt small and visible. When dessert was served, he slipped quietly from his chair and wandered into the hall. The adults barely noticed. He padded down the corridor until he found Clara again, this time in the kitchen, carrying a tray of dishes. "Daniel," she whispered urgently, "he shouldn't be here." "I don't like them," he said simply. Clara set down the tray and knelt so her eyes met his. "Don't like who?" "The ladies," he admitted. "They laugh too much. It's not real. And father, he never laughs at all." Clara studied him, her heart aching. For all his wealth, this boy was starved of the simplest things: truth, tenderness, joy. "You're very wise for your age," she said softly. "But don't let it make you sad. Someday, you'll learn to choose what feels real to you." Daniel tilted his head. "Like you?" Her breath caught, but she forced a gentle smile. "Maybe." At that moment, the kitchen door swung open. Richard Hamilton stood there, his imposing figure filling the frame. His dark eyes narrowed at the sight of his son crouched beside the maid. "Daniel," he barked, his voice sharp as thunder. "What are you doing here?" Daniel straightened, his small body trembling, but his chin lifted bravely. "Talking to Clara." Richard's gaze flicked to the maid, cold and dismissive. "Your tutor is waiting. Go. Now." Daniel hesitated, then whispered, "She's my friend." For the briefest second, Clara saw Richard's eyes darken, not with anger, but with something harder to name. A flicker of discomfort, perhaps even jealousy. But the moment passed. "Go, Daniel," he repeated. The boy obeyed, his small footsteps fading down the hall. Richard stepped closer to Clara, his voice low and cutting. "Do not encourage him. He is a Hamilton. He does not need companionship from a help." Clara bowed her head, though inside her chest burned. "Yes, sir." Richard lingered a moment longer, as if searching her face for defiance, then turned sharply and left. When he was gone, Clara pressed her hand against her heart. It beat fast, not from fear, but from something more complicated. She had seen a crack in the millionaire's armor, a flicker of humanity he would never admit to. And though Daniel did not understand it yet, his innocent friendship with the maid had already planted a seed that would grow into something none of them could ignore. The Hamilton mansion shone like a jewel that Saturday evening. Chandeliers glittered, violins sang, and servants glided through the room with trays of champagne. It was yet another gala, another gathering of the city's elite, hosted under the watchful eye of Richard Hamilton. But this night was not about charity or business. Not really. Tonight, the true spectacle was a competition brewing among three women who moved like queens through the glittering hall. Veronica, tall and striking, wore a crimson gown that clung to her figure, her dark hair piled high in elaborate curls. She was known for her sharp tongue and sharper ambition. Whispers followed her wherever she went, rumors of broken engagements, of men ruined after she had finished with them. Isabella, the youngest, floated in a gown of pale gold, her delicate features painted with a sweetness that fooled many. She carried herself like an angel, but her eyes were watchful, always calculating. Her family was wealthy, but not wealthy enough for her tastes. She saw Daniel Hamilton as her ladder to the highest rung of society. Catherine, poised and elegant, wore lavender silk embroidered with pearls. She was the oldest of the three, refined and disciplined, with a smile that rarely reached her eyes. Catherine's ambitions were less about passion and more about position. To be the wife of Richard Hamilton's son was to secure power for generations to come. The three women circled each other like predators dressed as swans, their laughter light, but edged with rivalry. Each took her turn charming Richard, fluttering her lashes, laying gentle hands on his arm, whispering compliments designed to stroke his pride. Richard tolerated them, even enjoyed the attention, though in his heart he saw them all for what they were: hungry, polished, ambitious. Still, one of them would make a suitable match for his son. A Hamilton heir needed a Hamilton-worthy wife. From the edges of the hall, Clara watched quietly. She carried a silver tray laden with glasses, her plain uniform stark against the sea of silk and jewels. The women's beauty did not stir envy in her. What unsettled her instead was their eyes, the way they glanced at her, quick and dismissive, like one might glance at a stain on a dress. Daniel noticed too. The boy stood beside his father for a time, dutifully shaking hands, bowing when instructed. But when the three women gathered near him, their perfume thick in the air, Daniel squirmed. Such a handsome young man, Isabella cooed, crouching slightly so her golden curls framed her face. "Tell me, Daniel, what do you like to do for fun?" Daniel looked at her, then at his father, unsure how to answer. I like to read," he said softly. "Of course he does," Catherine chimed in smoothly. "A mind like his will grow into a great businessman, just like his father." Veronica smiled tightly, slipping a manicured hand over Richard's arm. "If he inherits half of your brilliance, Mr. Hamilton, the world will tremble at his feet." The women laughed lightly, but Daniel only frowned. Their words didn't feel real. He wanted to escape. His eyes drifted across the hall until he saw Clara slipping through the crowd with her tray. For the first time that night, he smiled. He tugged at his father's sleeve. "May I go to the kitchen?" Richard's brows furrowed. "Why?" "I'm not hungry," Daniel muttered. Richard sighed, but before he could answer, Veronica leaned in. "Children grow restless at these things. Let him run along, Mr. Hamilton." Richard nodded, distracted, and turned back to his guests. Daniel slipped away, his small frame disappearing into the shadows. He found Clara near the kitchen doors, setting down her tray. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Daniel," she whispered, "he shouldn't be here again." "I don't like them," he admitted, his cheeks flushing. Clara knelt, smoothing the hair back from his forehead. "The three ladies?" He nodded. "They're fake." Clara blinked, surprised at his honesty, then chuckled softly. "You're not wrong, but you mustn't say that out loud." Daniel pouted. "They talk to father like he's a prize to win, but when they talk to me, they don't mean it. You mean it when you talk to me." Her heart ached at his words. This child saw through masks most adults couldn't pierce. She wanted to protect him, though she knew protection was not her place. "Daniel," came a stern voice. Richard stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes flicking between his son and the maid. "Back inside." "Now." Daniel hesitated, then whispered to Clara, "Don't let them win." Richard's brows snapped together. "What did you say?" "Nothing, father," Daniel said quickly, lowering his eyes. He obeyed, walking past his father into the hall. Richard lingered, his gaze heavy on Clara. "Do not encourage him to speak out of turn." Clara lowered her head. "Yes, sir." But inside something burned. She wasn't teaching Daniel to defy his father. The boy was simply speaking truths that no one else dared. Later that night, as the guests departed, the three women gathered in the cloakroom, their masks slipping the moment the Hamiltons were out of sight. "Did you see the way he looked at that maid?" Veronica hissed, tugging on her first stole. The boy lit up like she was some kind of angel. Isabella smirked. Children are easily charmed. A kind word, a smile doesn't mean anything. Catherine's lips thinned. Perhaps. But Richard did not look pleased. If that maid becomes an influence on the boy, it could complicate things. Mark my words, she'll need to be put in her place. The three exchanged knowing glances, a silent pact forming between them. In their minds, Clara was not a person. She was an obstacle. And obstacles were meant to be removed. In the grand bedroom upstairs, Richard stood at the window, the city lights glowing in the distance. He replayed the night in his mind, the women's laughter, his son's restlessness, the maid's quiet defiance. He told himself she was nothing, just a servant, replaceable, invisible. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he saw not the glittering gowns of Veronica, Isabella, or Catherine. He saw Clara's steady eyes as she knelt beside his son, eyes that held no hunger for power, no performance, only truth. He scowled at his reflection in the glass, unsettled by the thought. He had built his empire on control, yet here was a slip of a girl threatening to undo him. Not with words, not with ambition, but with the quiet strength of simply being herself. The summer gala was supposed to be perfect. Richard Hamilton had spared no expense. Crystal chandeliers glowed like stars. A string quartet played in the garden. And the city's most influential figures mingled across the marble terrace. It was not only a celebration of Hamilton Industries' success, but also a subtle audition for his son's future bride. Veronica, Isabella, and Catherine were there, gleaming like jewels, their laughter floating through the night air. Clara worked in the background, as always, her uniform simple, her movements precise. She carried trays of champagne flutes, her eyes lowered, careful to avoid drawing attention. Yet as she slipped between glittering gowns and tailor suits, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling along her spine. The unease proved right. It began with smoke. At first it was faint, curling up from the far corner of the garden where decorative lanterns glowed. Then came the acrid smell, wood-burning, fabric-catching. Within moments, a flame leapt high, licking across the silk canopy draped over the terrace. A guest screamed. Another shouted for water. Panic spread faster than the fire itself. The quartet's music screeched to a halt as chairs overturned, glasses shattered, and the crowd surged toward the exits. "Get the children," someone cried. Richard Hamilton, standing at the head of the terrace, barked orders to the staff. "Keep calm. Control the situation." But his own voice shook, the illusion of perfect control cracking. Clara's heart lurched. She scanned the crowd for Daniel. The boy had been playing near the fountain a moment ago. Now she saw him, frozen at the edge of the flames, his small body trembling as sparks rained dangerously close. "Daniel?" Clara shouted, dropping her tray. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She ran. The canopy collapsed with a roar, fire cascading across the terrace. Clara leapt through the smoke, shielding her mouth with her arm. The boy stood rooted, wide-eyed, unable to move. Clara scooped him into her arms, just as a burning beam crashed behind them. Heat seared her skin, the acrid smoke clawing at her lungs. She stumbled forward, clutching Daniel tightly against her chest. "Close your eyes," she gasped. Daniel obeyed, burying his face against her shoulder. Clara pushed through the chaos, past overturned tables, past fleeing guests, past the shrieks of the three classy women who scrambled toward the gates, their jeweled gowns tangling around their legs as they abandoned everyone but themselves. At last, Clara broke free into the garden's open air. She collapsed to her knees on the damp grass, coughing violently, still clutching Daniel. The boy lifted his head, tears streaking his soot-stained cheeks. "You're safe," she whispered, brushing his hair back, ignoring the blisters forming along her arm where sparks had landed. By then, Richard was there. He knelt beside them, his usually composed face stricken with panic. He gathered Daniel into his arms, checking him desperately. "Are you hurt?" "Daniel, talk to me." "I'm okay, Father," Daniel whispered. "Clara saved me." Richard turned, his dark eyes locking on the maid. For once, his gaze held no contempt, no dismissal. It held something raw: shock, gratitude, fear. Her sleeve was burned, her skin blistered, yet her expression was calm. "He's fine," she said softly. For a long moment, Richard could not speak. Around them, staff battled the flames with buckets of water. Guests wailed about their ruined gowns. The three women fussed dramatically about singed hems. But all Richard could see was the maid cradling his son as if he were her own. That night, when the fire was finally contained and the last guest had departed in outrage or relief, the mansion fell into uneasy silence. Daniel refused to leave Clara's side. She sat with him in the drawing room, holding a cool cloth to his forehead, whispering gentle reassurances. He clung to her hand, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Richard entered quietly, his gaze unreadable. He dismissed the other servants with a flick of his hand until only the three of them remained. Clara stood, smoothing her scorched uniform. "Sir, I apologize for overstepping. But your son—" "You saved his life," Richard interrupted, his voice low. He studied her blistered arm, his jaw tightening. "You could have died." Clara lowered her eyes. It was instinct. Instinct, Richard repeated, almost himself. He glanced at Daniel, who had drifted into sleep, his small hand still wrapped around Clara's fingers. Then his gaze returned to her. No one else moved, not even those women who claimed to care so deeply for this family. Only you. Clara said nothing. Her silence was not submission. It was steadiness, an anchor in the storm. Richard exhaled, his chest heavy with a feeling he could not name. For the first time in years, his wealth, his empire, his perfect image meant nothing. Tonight, it had not been his power or money that saved his son. It had been the courage of a woman he had long dismissed as invisible. "Clara," he said at last, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "I owe you everything." Her eyes lifted to his, startled by the rawness in his tone. For a fleeting moment, the walls around his heart cracked, and in that silence, something passed between them. A spark, quiet but undeniable. Clara quickly looked away, smoothing Daniel's blanket. "He should rest now, sir." Richard lingered, torn between pride and gratitude, between the world he had built and the truth staring him in the face. Finally he nodded. "Yes," he murmured. "Let him rest." But long after he left the room, he could not forget the image burned into his mind. Clara, braving fire and smoke, shielding his son with nothing but her body. And for the first time in his life, Richard Hamilton felt small in the presence of someone who had nothing. The morning after the fire, the Hamilton mansion was strangely quiet. The smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the drapes, despite the staff's frantic scrubbing and polishing. Crystal vases had been shattered, the silk canopy ruined, but it was not the damage to the house that haunted Richard Hamilton. It was the image of Clara in the flames. He sat alone in his study. The newspaper spread before him. The headlines were merciless. Hamilton Gala ends in chaos. Fire mars evening of elegance. Guests flee as panic erupts. There was no mention of Clara, no photograph of the maid carrying his son through the smoke. The reporters had written of jewels scorched, gowns ruined, pride wounded. But the truest story of the night, that of a humble maid saving a millionaire's heir, was invisible. Richard's jaw tightened as he set the paper aside. Meanwhile, Clara tended to Daniel in his bedroom. The boy had refused the doctor's care unless Clara stayed beside him. Now she sat at the edge of the bed, reading softly from a children's book. Daniel's eyes fluttered open. "Clara?" "Yes, Daniel." "Were you scared?" His voice was small, trembling at the edges. Clara smiled faintly. "Yes, very. But sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about moving, even when fear tells you to stop." Daniel considered this, his young brow furrowing in thought. "Father always says fear makes you weak." Clara brushed his hair back gently. "No, Daniel. Fear makes you human. What matters is what you do with it." The boy's eyes softened. He took her hand in his. "I want to be brave like you." Her heart squeezed. "You already are." Later that afternoon, Richard entered quietly. He stopped short at the sight of his son clutching Clara's hand, his small face peaceful for the first time since the fire. Clara rose at once, smoothing her plain dress. "He's been resting, sir. The doctor says he's well." Richard's gaze lingered on his son, then shifted to Clara. For once, his sharp eyes did not hold contempt. They held something else, something unsettled. "You're hurt," he said gruffly, nodding toward the blisters on her arm. "It's nothing," Clara murmured. "It is not nothing," Richard countered, his tone firm. "Send for the physician." Clara hesitated. He should tend to Daniel first. Richard stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Daniel is safe because of you. Don't dismiss what you did." For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Clara's steady gaze disarmed him more than he cared to admit. He broke the silence with a brusque nod and left, but the moment lingered in his chest like a spark refusing to die. That evening, the classy women returned, cloaked in false concern. Veronica swept into the drawing room in black silk, her tone grave. "Such a dreadful ordeal, Mr. Hamilton. I hardly slept, worrying about Daniel's safety." Isabella followed, her golden curls shining. "It was divine providence that no greater harm was done. Surely, your swift commands prevented the worst, Mr. Hamilton." Catherine added smoothly, "Yes, your leadership was admirable. Without you, chaos would have consumed the evening entirely." Richard listened, stone-faced. Their words fell like drops of honey, sweet but sickening. Daniel, seated beside Clara on the sofa, blurted, "It wasn't father. Clara saved me." The room stilled. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she quickly bowed her head. "Daniel?" "It's true," he insisted. "She ran through the fire. She carried me out. She's the brave one." Veronica's painted smile tightened. "Children exaggerate," she said lightly. "I'm sure the staff all played their part." "No." Daniel's small fists clenched. "She's the only one who came for me." "You ran away." Gasps circled the room. Isabella's face drained of color. Catherine's lips pressed into a thin line. Richard's gaze swept across them, his jaw hardening. For the first time, he saw the women not as potential wives for his son, but as they truly were, ornaments polished on the outside, hollow within. "Enough," Richard said coldly. "That will be all for tonight." The women exchanged stiff smiles, but as they left, Clara caught the venom in their eyes, the silent promise that they would not forget this humiliation. Later, Richard stood at the window of his private study, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. His reflection stared back, haunted. He thought of Clara's blistered arm, her steady eyes, the way Daniel clung to her, as if she were his anchor in the storm. All his life, Richard had believed strength came from wealth, from control, from never bending. But last night, it was not his millions that had saved his son. It was the courage of a woman with nothing to her name but integrity. And for the first time in years, Richard felt something stir in him, something dangerously close to admiration. The Hamilton mansion, though repaired and polished after the fire, was no longer the same. Something invisible had shifted in its grand halls, an energy that could not be explained but could certainly be felt. Clara noticed it first in small ways. The way Daniel reached for her hand whenever they entered a crowded room. The way Richard's gaze lingered too long when she spoke, though he said little. The way silence stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. It unsettled her. She had always known her place, silent, invisible, useful only as long as she blended into the background. But now, with every lingering glance, every word of gratitude Richard nearly let slip, that boundary blurred. One evening, Clara sat in the library with Daniel, reading aloud from Treasure Island. The boy leaned against her, rapt with attention as her voice brought the story to life. Richard entered quietly, pausing at the threshold. He did not announce himself. He simply stood there, watching. Clara's voice was low and melodic, carrying warmth that filled the cavernous library. Daniel's eyes shone, his small hand clinging to hers as though afraid she might vanish with the closing of the book. When Clara reached the final line, Daniel sighed happily. "Read it again," he begged. Clara laughed softly. "Tomorrow night, perhaps. Even pirates need their rest." Richard stepped forward then, his presence drawing both their eyes. Daniel brightened. "Father, Clara reads better than anyone. She makes the words sound real." Richard's gaze flicked to her. "I don't doubt it." His voice was softer than usual, almost reverent. Clara lowered her eyes quickly. "Would you like me to prepare tea, sir?" He shook his head. "No. Stay." The word startled her. Not a command this time, but an invitation. For a long moment, the three of them sat in companionable silence, the crackle of the fireplace filling the room. Richard watched his son rest against the maid's shoulder, and for the first time in years, he felt peace. But peace rarely lasts in a house of envy. The three classy women, Veronica, Isabella, and Catherine, watched the shifting dynamic with growing resentment. Their efforts to charm Richard seemed futile. Worse, Daniel openly ignored them, often hiding behind Clara's skirts when they entered the room. He clings to her like she's his mother, Isabella hissed one afternoon as they sat together in the conservatory. It's humiliating. She made a spectacle of herself during the fire, Veronica sneered, twirling her pearl necklace, running through flames as if she were some heroine. Richard should have dismissed her immediately, but no, he lets her linger. Catherine, the most calculating of the three, leaned back with a thin smile. Gentlemen may admire bravery, but let us not forget, Richard Hamilton values status above all else. He will never marry a maid, not unless she is made to stumble. The others leaned closer. What do you suggest? Veronica asked. Catherine's smile sharpened. We do not push her out directly. We let her reveal herself as unfit. A whisper here, a misstep there. All it takes is doubt. Men like Richard do not forgive mistakes. Their laughter, low and poisonous, echoed through the glass-walled room. The days that followed proved Catherine's words true. Clara found her duties oddly more difficult. Items she had carefully polished went missing and later reappeared in odd places. Instructions she had never received were suddenly expected of her. One afternoon, Richard confronted her about an overlooked dinner order that had, in fact, been deliberately changed by Veronica. Clara accepted the blame silently. She always had, but Richard noticed something. The flicker of pain in her eyes, the way she bowed her head without protest. That night, he replayed the moment in his mind. A woman who had risked her life for his son would not carelessly neglect her duties. No, someone wanted her to appear incompetent. The realization unsettled him. Meanwhile, Daniel grew bolder in his defense of Clara. At breakfast, when Isabella mocked Clara's plain dress, Daniel slammed his spoon against the table. She's better than all of you, he shouted, his small face fierce. Daniel, Richard warned, but the boy pressed on. She's kind. She's brave. She saved me. You only care about dresses and jewels. The women gasped, their painted smiles faltering. Clara tried to hush him, but Richard silenced the room with a raised hand. His gaze swept over the three women, cold and sharp. My son speaks his mind. Perhaps more of us should. For once, the women had no reply. That evening, Clara prepared to retire when Richard intercepted her in the corridor. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes burned with something she could not name. You endure too much, he said quietly. She blinked. Sir? I see it, he continued. The missing items, the altered instructions, the whispers meant to wound. Do not think me blind. Clara hesitated. It is not my place to. Clara, he interrupted, stepping closer. His voice softened, almost pleading. It is your place to be honest with me. Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, she thought he might reach for her hand. But then he stepped back, the mask of composure slipping over his features once more. Good night, he said, his tone clipped. Yet as he turned away, Clara saw the truth in his eyes. Admiration, conflict, something dangerously close to desire. And it terrified her. The air in the Hamilton mansion grew heavier with each passing day. Whispers slithered through corridors, and sidelong glances followed Clara wherever she went. She had long grown used to invisibility, but now it seemed her every move was noticed, scrutinized, judged, twisted into something it was not. The three classy women had grown restless. Subtle sabotage no longer satisfied them. Catherine, ever strategist, knew the only way to be rid of Clara once and for all was to plant a scandal so vile that Richard would have no choice but to cast her out. And so their plot began. It was Veronica Who struck first? One afternoon, as Clara carried fresh linens through the hall, Veronica accidentally brushed past, knocking the stack from her arms. "Oh, how clumsy of you," Veronica said sweetly, her voice loud enough for the butler to hear. One would think even a maid could manage a few sheets. Clara bent to pick them up, cheeks burning. She said nothing. Silence was her shield. But that night at dinner, Veronica remarked to Richard, "The staff has grown careless. Even the simplest duties are left undone." Richard's expression did not change, but his eyes flickered toward Clara, who stood silently by the wall. Isabella, ever fond of theatrics, played her hand next. She claimed that a piece of her jewelry, a diamond bracelet worth thousands, had gone missing. She insisted she had last seen it in the sitting room, where Clara had been dusting. "How strange," Isabella said loudly, patting her wrist as Richard entered. "One hopes the staff here is trustworthy. A woman can never be too careful with her belongings." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Clara's heart clenched, but she forced her hands steady as she folded the napkins. She would not defend herself, not before she had even been accused. Richard's gaze cut sharply toward Isabella. "I will have the staff quarters searched. If nothing is found, I suggest you look to your jeweler before you slander honest hands." Isabella flushed, her victory stolen before it could bloom. Clara's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, Richard had defended her openly. But Catherine's blow was the cruelest. One evening, she approached Richard privately, her expression demure. "Richard," she began, lowering her voice. "There are whispers." He arched a brow. "What kind of whispers?" She hesitated, feigning reluctance. "About Clara. That she spends too much time with your son. That she allows his affection to become unhealthy. People wonder if it's proper." Richard's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Who are these people?" Catherine sighed dramatically. "You know how society is. They talk. I only mention it because I care for Daniel's reputation and yours." Richard said nothing. His silence was colder than words. Catherine mistook it for agreement and left, satisfied she had planted the seed. But Richard sat long into the night, his glass of bourbon untouched, fury simmering beneath his controlled exterior. The breaking point came days later. Clara entered the parlor one morning to find Daniel sobbing. His small fists beat against the sofa cushions as Veronica loomed above him, her smile sharp and cruel. "What's wrong?" Clara rushed him, dropping to her knees. She said you'll be gone soon." Daniel wailed, clutching her. She said, "Father doesn't want you here anymore." Clara's eyes flashed as she turned on Veronica. "How dare you?" Veronica's painted brows arched. "I merely told him the truth. Maids come and go. He mustn't grow too attached." Clara's hands trembled. Never in all her years of service had she spoken back to a lady of status. But something within her broke. "You frighten a child for your amusement." Her voice was steady, though her chest heaved. "You think your jewels make you noble? You're nothing but cruel." Gasps filled the doorway. Isabella and Catherine had arrived, drawn by the commotion. "How dare you speak to us that way?" Isabella hissed. Richard's voice thundered from behind them. "Enough." All eyes turned. He stood tall in the doorway, his face carved from stone, his eyes burning with fury. "You shame yourselves," he said, his voice like a whip. "All of you." The women sputtered protests, but he silenced them with a glare. "Leave this house," he commanded. "Now, and do not return." Veronica's mouth fell open. "Richard, you can't mean." "I can and I do." "Out." Catherine tried to salvage their dignity, but the venom in Richard's gaze sent them sweeping from the room in silence, their heels clicking furiously against the marble floors. When the last of their perfume had faded, Richard turned to Clara. Daniel clung to her skirts, his small face wet with tears. Clara's own eyes shimmered, though she held her head high. Richard stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You have suffered more than you should. Because of me. Because I let them stay." Clara shook her head. "It is not your fault, sir. This is my place." No, his tone cut her short. "Your place is not to be humiliated. Not in this house. Not in my sight." Their eyes locked then, her humility against his fierce resolve. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, undeniable and dangerous. And for the first time, Clara did not look away. The house felt strangely lighter after Veronica, Isabella, and Catherine had been sent away. Their perfume no longer choked the air. Their whispers no longer poisoned the corridors. Yet Clara could not relax. For days, she kept to her duties with quiet diligence, avoiding Richard whenever she could. She told herself she belonged only in the shadows. Yet her heart betrayed her, fluttering whenever his footsteps echoed nearby, burning whenever his gaze lingered. Daniel, however, showed no restraint. One morning, Clara was dusting the shelves in the library when the boy marched in, chin lifted proudly. Richard followed, amused by his son's unusually serious expression. "Father," Daniel declared, planting himself between them, "I've decided something important." Richard arched a brow. "Oh." Daniel turned to Clara, his little hands reaching for hers. "Clara should be my mother." Clara froze, the duster slipping from her fingers. Her lips parted, but no words came. Richard's expression flickered, shock first, then something deeper, raw. He crouched to his son's level. "And why do you say that, Daniel?" "Because she loves me," Daniel said simply. "Not for what I am, not for money, not for anything but me. She's brave, she's kind. When I'm with her, I feel safe. Isn't that what a mother should be?" Clara's throat tightened. Tears stung her eyes, but she forced them back. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I can never." "Yes, you can." Daniel interrupted fiercely. "You're already everything to me. Why can't Father see it too?" The boy's innocence cut through the silence like a blade. Richard's gaze lifted to Clara, and for once, he did not mask his heart. "Daniel, go to your room for a moment," he said gently. "Clara and I must speak alone." Daniel pouted but obeyed, giving Clara's hands one last squeeze before scurrying away. The silence that followed was thick, trembling with unspoken truths. Richard rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Clara's. "Do you realize what you've done?" Clara clasped her trembling hands together. "If I've overstepped, if his words offend you, I beg your forgiveness. I've only ever tried to care for him as best I could." "You saved his life," Richard interrupted, his voice low, rough with emotion. "You've given him something I never could, warmth, trust, a heart that listens." Clara shook her head. "I am nothing but a maid, sir. My duty is to serve, not to." "Do not say that," he cut in sharply, stepping closer. His intensity startled her, but she could not look away. "You speak as though your worth is measured by your station. Do you not see, Clara? You are more than that, more than all the jewels and gowns those women flaunted. You are," he broke off, struggling for words, his control faltering. "You are what this house has been missing, what I have been missing." Clara's breath hitched. "Sir." "Richard," he corrected softly. The sound of his name on his own lips, spoken as an invitation, made her heart race. She shook her head, desperate to cling to reason. "You cannot mean this. What would society say? A millionaire marrying his maid? They would laugh scorn." "Let them," Richard said fiercely. "Let them choke on their laughter. What do I care for their gossip when the truth is here before me?" His hand lifted as if to touch her face, then hovered, trembling, unwilling to cross the final line. "Tell me, Clara, am I alone in this? Or do you feel it too?" Her heart pounded so loudly she thought he might hear it. Every instinct told her to step back, to protect herself. But she couldn't. Her voice shook. She swallowed hard. I feel too. The admission hung between them like a flame catching fire. For a long moment neither moved. Their eyes locked, their breaths shallow. Then Richard exhaled, a sound of both relief and surrender. He stepped back, forcing control over himself. Not here. Not like this. I won't dishonor you. Clara's eyes widened. His restraint, his refusal to take what he could have commanded, said more than any declaration of love. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope. That evening, Clara sat by Daniel's bedside, her heart still trembling from a confession. The boy, drowsy with sleep, reached for her hand. You'll stay, won't you? He murmured. Forever? She kissed his forehead softly. Forever, Daniel. But even as the words left her lips, she knew forever would not be simple. The battle had only just begun. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Clara had known. Richard's dismissal of Veronica, Isabella, and Catherine had rippled through the city like wildfire. At first, whispers filled the drawing rooms and private clubs. Hamilton cast out 3 of society's most eligible women. For what reason? Some speculated business disputes. Others murmured of hidden scandals. But soon sharper rumors took hold. There is someone else, people whispered. A woman of no name, no fortune. A maid. Clara bore the weight of those whispers in silence. She moved through the mansion with dignity, her head bowed, her heart torn. Richard had confessed his feelings and she her own. But still, the world outside waited, eager to tear them apart. One evening, as Clara cleared away the remnants of supper, the butler approached her quietly. Miss Clara, he said, his voice unusually gentle. Sir Hamilton has requested your presence in the grand hall. Her brow furrowed. At this hour? He inclined his head. Yes, he insists. Clara smoothed her plain dress with trembling hands and made her way toward the hall. When she entered, she stopped short. The chandeliers blazed with light, casting golden brilliance across the marble floor. A crowd had gathered, business associates, political figures, and society's most watchful eyes. It was a gathering she would never have been invited to, let alone placed at its center. And at that center stood Richard. Tall, commanding, his presence filled the room. Daniel stood proudly beside him, his small chest puffed out, as though he too were part of something monumental. Clara, Richard said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. Come forward. She froze, every instinct screaming to flee. But Daniel ran to her, tugging her hand. Don't be afraid, he whispered. It's time. With hesitant steps, Clara walked into the blaze of light, her plain dress stark against the jeweled gowns of the women watching. She felt their scorn like knives at her back, but she kept her chin high. Richard's gaze never wavered. When she reached him, he took her hand, not as a master to his servant, but as a man to the woman he loved. Gasps echoed through the hall. My friends, Richard began, his deep voice commanding silence. For years, I believed success was measured in wealth, in influence, in the opinions of society. I surrounded myself with those who glittered, but in truth, their shine was empty. His grip on Clara's hand tightened, steadying her trembling. It was this woman, he continued, who taught me the meaning of loyalty, courage, and love. She saved my son's life. She restored joy to this home. She gave where others only took. And today, before all of you, I tell you plainly, she is the one I choose. Not as a servant, not as a whisper of scandal, but as my wife. The hall erupted, gasps, protests, murmurs of outrage. A few clapped politely, but most stared in shock. Richard silenced them with a single thunderous command. Enough. His gaze swept across the room. Mock me if you wish. Withdraw your invitations, your investments, your respect. I will not bend. I have lived by society's rules long enough. Tonight I choose my own." He turned back to Clara, his eyes softening. "Clara Brooks, will you marry me?" Her breath caught. Tears spilled before she could stop them. For a lifetime she had been invisible, a shadow in grand houses, a name forgotten as soon as it was spoken. And now here she stood, asked to be seen, truly seen, for the first time. "Yes," she whispered. Then stronger, her voice steady. "Yes, Richard, I will." Daniel cheered so loudly the hall rang with his joy. "I told you," he shouted to the stunned crowd. "I told you Clara's my mother now." Laughter broke from some, scandalized gasps from others. But Richard only lifted Clara's hand to his lips, sealing the promise. The wedding followed weeks later, quiet but radiant. Richard refused the trappings of spectacle. He wanted no audience of gossips, only those who had stood with him in truth. In the small chapel bathed in morning light, Clara walked the aisle in a simple gown of ivory lace, her dark hair crowned with a wreath of white roses. Daniel carried the rings, his smile so wide it could have outshone the sun itself. When Richard took her hands and spoke his vows, his voice trembled, not with nerves, but with reverence. "I once believed love was weakness," he said softly, only for her ears. "But you, Clara, have shown me it is strength. You are my heart, my home, my forever." And when she answered, her words were steady, shining. "All my life, I was told to stay silent, to take only what was given. But today, I claim what I never thought I could. I claim you, Richard. I claim this family. And I will stand by you in shadows or in light, until the end." When their lips met, Daniel clapped so hard the minister chuckled. "Finally," the boy cried. And so it was done. That night in the quiet of the Hamilton estate, now truly a home, Clara sat by the fire, Daniel asleep in her lap. Richard watched them, his heart so full it ached. "You've given us both more than I ever deserved," he murmured. Clara looked up, her eyes glowing. "No, Richard, we've given each other everything we needed." He leaned down, kissing her gently, and for the first time, the mansion did not feel vast and lonely. It felt alive. Forever had begun.